Hello, everyone. In this episode, I'm happy to have another young Indian with us, part of the Voice of the Young series. Right now, we have with us Partho Sen. Let's listen to him. Over to you, Partho.
Hi everyone. Thank you for listening if you're listening. I'm Partho. I am currently pursuing my master's in economics at Azim Premji University. And just before I say anything else, just a brief on what I'm going to talk about. So, broadly, I've thought about four things that I want to share with you all. And since it's a lot to cover, I won't be going too in depth into any single topic, but you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. So, firstly, I'd like to start by talking about some of my research because research is sort of a big thing that's something that is very important to me, and that's what I want to have a career in. So, I've done broadly two research projects till now, which are of sort of import, and they are, I mean, in terms of statistics, it's sort of sound in that sense. So, in that sense, if I talk about research projects, there's two of them, and the first one is a thesis that I did at my undergraduate uh, education at Gokhale. So that one looked at the effect of Make in India policy. So it's been Make in India. It was inaugurated in September of 2014. So it's been roughly 10 years. I mean, what has happened? Has it actually improved sort of value added in manufacturing, FDI, employment? What has happened? I mean, we have a broad idea of things, uh, but I quite frankly did not see any papers that actually looked at the numbers. So that's what I did. And I mean, to no one's surprise, I found that Make in India has not, in fact, based on a number of metrics, I looked at a variety of indices. And so one of the interesting sort of metrics I looked at was the business expectations index that is revealed by the RBI. So, in terms of all these different metrics, I found that there has been, at best, there has been no change, and at worst, manufacturing value added in terms of the GDP has in fact gone down. So that was a kind of interesting and not so optimistic conclusion that I came to. But I guess we all knew this. I mean, this has been common knowledge that manufacturing, I mean, the idea was to push the manufacturing sector, which has already never been part of India's sort of development model. But unfortunately, the whole FDI route has not worked out. That was the first project I worked at. And the next one, which I'm currently working at, this I started as a part of my internship at ISI Delhi this summer. And it was under Dr. and still is under Dr. Abhirup Mukhopadhyay, and he's been advising me. So this paper is very interesting in the sense that it looks at rural households, in particular farmers, those who are self-employed in farming and those who are casual labor in agriculture. What happens when they suffer a rainfall shock? What is a rainfall shock? A rainfall shock could be either a drought or a flood. And what I look at is the extremities on both ends. So the literature till now has not necessarily looked at the differential effects that a positive shock or a negative shock could have. And intuitively, one can tell that a flood is going to have a very different effect. I mean, both are through the mechanism of crops. So falling crops, your crop sales fall, and through that, you don't get the expected income that you sort of have an idea that you will get that. So I look at that, and what I find is that, I mean, first of all, we should also establish the fact that in India, I mean, a large proportion of the Indian population is rural. And again, a large proportion of their employment is agriculture. So this topic is quite critical. And again, in the context of climate change, this becomes even more pervasive. So what I find is that floods are the idea of floods, that is what largely drives rural borrowing. First of all, the on an average, and the effect for droughts is not very clear when you look at the entire sample, because this is possible because droughts are something that have concurrently happened throughout Indian history. I mean, even if we look at the evidence, this is there. And so one can expect that there's a lot of variation in the way farmers have adapted to drought. So, I mean, one of them is irrigation, obviously, but there's also other adaptive mechanisms at the household level, which are technically unobservable, but we can sort of intuit. But floods, on the other hand, I find that in recent years, especially due to climate change, the idea of flash floods, which sort of, especially in districts that are river fed, that has increased much more. And because it's such a recent phenomena, households have not had the time to actually adapt to it. So that is the major finding on a full sample scale. Now I also look at the mechanism. So there's two ways in which household indebtedness can actually go up. One is that contemporaneous to a shock, like during the shock period, households borrow more as compared to districts which where there's no shock. The second way is that on the existing loans that the household has, on the historic loans, repayment of those loans during the same period goes down. These are two broad mechanisms by which indebtedness at the end of the survey period can go up. So, what I find is that, in fact, it's not that repayment falls necessarily, but this effect is largely due to new borrowing. So households essentially, and this is effect essentially even more true in flood areas. Districts which have floods, households are pushed to borrow more. And this borrowing, I mean, where does it come from? One is that this finding is also very interesting, is that there is substitution away from friends and family. I mean, intuitively you would expect that in rural areas, households, there's a huge pervasiveness of social networks. So what I term as trust loans, and there's a lot of literature on this, that households sort of take a lot of loans, especially during times of lean season. During the lean season, when there is no sort of agricultural employment, households take loans to for their consumption, to smooth their consumption. So what I find is that loans from friends and family, this goes down. And this is expected because once there is such a correlated shock that goes across the village, all the households are affected. Everybody is a flood affected household. So you can't expect to get, loans from your friends and family. So this goes down, and simultaneously, loans from cooperatives, especially cooperative societies, what are technically called as primary agricultural cooperative societies or PACs, that goes up. So this is a very interesting finding. And for every other credit agency, which include scheduled commercial banks, regional rural banks, those who are expected to provide insurance when agricultural households face such a shock, there is no difference. I find that, and even for, especially for money lenders, professional money lenders, and agriculture money lenders, I find that there is again no difference, which is, I mean, not that great of a finding. But the cooperative society point is quite interesting because, theoretically speaking, cooperative societies are what we would call credit agencies that are quite sort of close to a village because they exist. So you could say that there's at least one cooperative society per village, if that village has that access. So you could say that the community, the network effects, there's a lot of community pervasiveness. So people know each other, the cooperative society members, they know which type of lender, which type of borrower is going to borrow from them, what are the assets they possess. So in that sense, the whole sort of process of taking a loan becomes much easier because you can always make sure that the person, because it's the same person in the village, you can make sure that they pay back. Or if they don't pay back, there's consequences. This does not happen at the level of a RRB, regional rural bank, and scheduled commercial bank. Plus, there's evidence to say the documentation, I mean, taking a loan is much harder from them. So this is one finding. And finally, the last thing that I'd like to talk about is that there's also a bunch of heterogeneity, because this is obviously, these are all conditional means. When you run a regression, it's a conditional mean. But what I find is that I run a bunch of heterogeneity checks across various sort of categories. I find that irrigation, so the amount of land irrigated, as a proportion of the entire land, that plays a large and significant effect in terms of how all these shocks affect borrowing. I find that if there is, as a proportion of the total land, irrigated land is more, then households have greater access to loans from scheduled commercial banks and RRBs. But conversely, as the amount of irrigated land goes down, again they shift to these cooperative societies. So this is a very interesting finding in terms of credit constraints, because uh,
mm,
an agricultural district which has more irrigation is quite likely to have be better off in terms of other developmental indicators. So what we find is that an already developed district does not have problems in getting loans from these large banks.
yeah,
So they don't particularly face those credit constraints. But when you conversely look at these less irrigated districts, you see them going towards these local, what would you call, local credit agencies, which
mm,
are may not be as equipped to provide loans,
mm,
especially in the case of a sort of correlated shock.
yeah,
So broadly, I mean, there's a bunch of other heterogeneities, but I mean, that's a paper I'm working on, and when it gets published, one can always look at that. And so the broad point of this finding is that local lives matter, local connections
mm,
matter. So the idea is to go bottom up instead of top down. Don't focus. Scheduled commercial banks are already doing well. RRBs are doing well, but you go down and look at the local level. You sort of enhance provision at that level so that
mm,
each village in itself can essentially insure itself against such shock. So that's the broad finding of this paper. And next, I'd like to talk about a bit about my research journey. So what I would say is that research is a very personal thing. I, by myself, has always been interested in. Uh, so I would like to start with the fact that I've been interested in physics since my school years. I've always wanted to start study in physics and get into physics research, particularly because I'm fascinated by the idea of causality. I find it very interesting that one can actually
mm,
isolate relationships, and
mm,
by being sure that it's in
mm,
fact this thing that's driving this change and not anything else.
mm,
But what changed was that in class, particularly in class 12, I sort of uh, went deeper into economics. Partially, it's because my father is also an economist, so partially influenced by that, and the fact that I just happened to look more into what economics is all about. I sort of decided to take a sort of leap of faith and took my economics education took my bachelor's in economics education. So what I would say is that I have been very lucky, because uh, there's a bunch of things that have to be in place during your childhood for you to actually have access to these. So for you to know that economics is there, there's physics, all these subjects where you can do research, the kind of research, and then based on the kind of person that you are. Personally, I'm a very curious person. I enjoy digging deep into things.
mm,
So then you can sort of tailor your career the way you want it to. But most kids don't have access to this, so they are unable to have an idea of what's available, and hence they don't sort of grow to their full potential. So I would say that, I mean, education, scientific education, especially scientific literacy, that's a big thing. And I have been lucky enough to have that education, and hence take this path towards economics research. And one of the key things that pushed me towards this kind of thing was,
mm,
during my second year in bachelor's, I never really had an idea of what I wanted to do. I mean, I have this degree, but I don't know what I want to do after this. So then, this was around the time that I also started looking into sort of the work of Nobel laureates Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And I looked at the fact that they somehow managed to do experiments in economics. Now, that was a very unique idea to me. economics was always a social science, and the idea of social science was fairly qualitative in my head till then. But I found that you can actually borrow ideas from biostatistics and all these various fields, and you run RCTs, you run experiments. And if you don't have experimental data, you can mimic experiments in observational data. So, I mean, using various statistical methods. So that, in fact, knowing that, started digging deep into that, and then I realized that this is what I want to do, because I've always been interested in this idea of causality, but I've never had a medium to essentially be able to apply it. So that was what sort of pushed my journey into economics research. And I would also like to mention that economics education in India, particularly, is kind of, it undermines itself in the way that it's presented. I would suggest that especially in class 11, 12, preferably before, you introduce economics as a whole, not because in science and physics, chemistry, you get a whole array of subjects and topics that you can look at, but in economics it's always at a bachelor's level. I've not looked at a school curriculum where they actually go deep into econometrics and statistics, which is intuitive. It's not as hard. If you're doing calculus, if you're doing integral calculus, you will not find it that difficult to grasp econometrics. So, one of my sort of pet peeves is that in Indian education, in school education, economics is not handled that well. And secondly, and this applies to sort of statistical education as a whole. This whole idea of looking at, if I talk about econometrics, the whole idea of looking at hypothesis tests separately from models. So you find all these, this is very specific. So you find all these tables where if this is true, if this assumption is true, you run this test. But the thing is that becomes, the student gets a little, this is my own experience, the student gets a little disillusioned. So it's this table that you memorize, but why are you doing that? There's no idea behind that. But when you take a model approach, you sort of, so in a regression, if you have a dependent variable and you have a dummy variable, that's essentially what you're doing is you're running an ANOVA, which is an analysis of variance. That is given as a separate test in your so-called test table. But you can always, in this model, you can include a bunch of other variables. You can control for other things. You can improve the model. There's a lot of more degrees of freedom. So when a student, at least in my case, looks at statistics as this from this model-based approach, things become quite clearer. You don't have to memorize anything. You have an intuitive understanding of what kind of model you have to run depending on the assumptions you have. And I'd also like to say some things about sort of scientific education as a whole. I feel like if one wants to ensure that sustainable development actually happens, I mean, with the so-called Viksit Bharat 2047 and all the ideas of development that we have, I feel that scientific education at the micro level is crucial. And India certainly does not have great statistics on that regard, especially because I feel that Indian education has always focused too much on the Indian investment in education has always been too much on the tertiary side. But you have to look at the base. I mean, you have to look at where, how much ground your investment itself is covering. And if you look at the numbers, not a large proportion of the population is ever going to have a college level education. So IITs are there, fine. IIMs are there, great. They are institutions of excellence and eminence. But now I feel that the focus has to go sort of down the ladder. You have to look at what's happening in these primary schools, what's happening in these secondary schools. I mean, it's not enough to just get kids into studying, but what are the outcomes? I mean, are they scoring well? Are they? We have to come up with better measures, more holistic measures of education, so that this scientific literacy, it has this agglomeration effect, and eventually we get more scientists and we get more people who are even statistically literate, at the even people who are not scientists, but they have this education to make sure that, oh, uh, so that they don't get. One of these things is that scamming is one big thing that I've always looked at, and you find that in India, especially in the worldwide, because of this lack of education, scientific education, people are very easily drawn into things that could be scams potentially, and then this is a whole loop which pulls out a lot of money. And if we are to get better at allocation, if we are to get better at investing in particular sort of sectors where we expect development to happen, we can't just lose a lot of money to avenues like this. So I believe that on a micro level, this is extremely important if we are to look at, if you have to expect any kind of development to happen. And I'd like to recommend a few YouTube channels which I find very interesting on this regard. One is on the point of models and not hypothesis tests. You can check out Quant Psych on YouTube. And on the points of scientific education, I'd like to recommend one Indian channel, which is Science is Dope, and two channels called Professor Dave Explains and a physicist called Angela Collier. If you just want to get an idea of how it is to think critically, I mean, you have information, how do you sort of go through that and get an output that is essentially going to help you and be effective? Just the idea of critical thinking, these channels are going to be very helpful. And lastly, I'd like also to give some tips for essentially researchers. These tips, I mean, I would have liked to have them when I was doing my own research. So, one thing which is always prevalent in this era is artificial intelligence, so AI. And I'd like to say that AI, there's ups and there's downs. I'd like to start with the fact that AI is quite overhyped. I mean, if you just look at a person who has a cursory knowledge of AI, they will sort of take part into this narrative that AI is the next best thing, which is true to an extent, but not really in the way that people may think. So AI is not intelligent. It is merely a large language model, which takes essentially, if you look at ChatGPT, if you look at all these other models, it is just a game of probability. Just because it has such an extremely large sort of training data set to work with, it is essentially able to minimize these errors to a very small percentage. But you still find that these models often hallucinate and give you wrong information. So it's always to use these models, and they're very helpful in programming. They're very helpful in generating ideas, but you always have to verify what is the output, and you have to all that personal human touch always has to be there. And I would say that ChatGPT in itself is an excellent research tool for all young people and people alike to use. I would say that don't get too bogged down by the number of AI tools. That there's hundreds of AI tools coming out every day, and even if there's certain tools that are more that are trained to work on particular tasks, it is likely the case, in my experience, the marginal returns from sort of going into this, looking at this bunch of different tools and getting that last bit of marginal output, I would say that that is not worth your time. It is much better to actually do the work, use AI as a help, use chat gpt, but uh, focus, just do your own work by yourself in that sense. Don't get bogged down by all these bunch of other things. And secondly, the other point to note is that information management, especially in this era where, I mean, if you have to do literature review, that can be the most overwhelming thing in the whole world. I mean, on what sort of differentials do you find papers? Do you want to look at all the papers? Do you want these specific topics? And there's hundreds of thousands of papers. So I would say that information management is extremely critical. And for that, I personally use a bunch of different tools. I use something called as Evernote, which helps you in what is called as information nesting. So what you want is that you have this bunch of information, but you have to classify them. If you don't classify them, you will never be able to use them in a productive sense. You actually have to write your paper. So you start nesting information in under various titles and subtitles. So one of the ways is you just tag. You have these tags. Say, I don't know, I'm writing a paper on consumption smoothing. I find a bunch of these papers which sort of follow that. So you have this one tag that these papers are on consumption smoothing. But these, in fact, this is this is like an average. Even within those papers, you could potentially have other information that is linked to other papers. So then you increase those tags. And when you want this particular paper and you don't remember the author, you just type in the number of tags that you want, and then hopefully, if you've sort of managed the papers right, you'll find that paper. And this exponentially brings down the time to essentially manage and use information that you've taken productively. So I use Evernote. There's other applications. You can always use something. There's Notion, there's Obsidian. Most of these are free to use. And especially in research, quantitative PhD research, I feel that in this era, this stuff is critical. So you just have to adapt to this. And lastly, I would also like to talk about data management. So when you do a project, I mean, this is a fault that I have noticed in myself as well. When you have a large number of data sets to work with, the issue becomes that you don't label them correctly. Essentially, you don't have a description of what that data set entails, and that starts causing a lot of problems later into your research process. So what I would recommend is document everything, every single idea you have. What data set are you using? Document everything so that when later you have to look back at it and find out what was the logic behind this thing that I did. It's very easy to forget because the bunch research is something like this that, I mean, you make hundreds of decisions which are micro decisions which end up in a sort of macro output. But then it's very hard to remember why you made that decision back, say, 1 week ago. So I would say that whenever you have files, just have a structure of how you name those files. Again, nest information. That's extremely, even in data sets. What sort of, you have different topics. So within those topics, you have these files, always nest information, and always sort of name them according to a predefined structure so that this doesn't uh, just cause problems much later into your research journey. Yeah, I think that's about it for the advice that I could give and about myself.
Okay, Partho, thank you very much. I mean, you sound very
Yeah.
like, to me, you sound very much like an economist's economist. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
This was
it's great to hear
yeah, yeah.
somebody who sounds like that and who talks economics, not about economics, but inside. Okay, so you are an insider. Okay, great, wonderful. I just want
That's
to,
what I wish to be.
okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Of course. Yeah.
when you talked about education, I think
Yeah.
there's one point I want to add here, which most people don't know. And that is actually what happens from the age 0 to 3 is the most important thing.
Right.
It's too late to go to class 5. When people say they are focused on elementary education, actually,
Hmm.
it is really much more important to go 0 to 3. And there's in the NEP 2020, there are actually 3 paragraphs on 0 to 3. Okay, you can
I
look them
see.
up, but they are never going to be implemented because they are relying on Anganwadi Ashas to do it. And there's no way that these women can do it because they have no training, no experience, nothing. They're overworked, underpaid. You are not going to get the result. So actually, it is 0 to 3 that India should
Right.
increase its focus on, which is outside the school system, which is outside any
Certainly.
system, which we don't have any system for 0 to 3. So Do read about it. Do I try to tell young people
Right, right, right.
like you that the government's not going to be able to do it. No government can do it. Okay, it has to be done on an experimental basis by non-profits, in my opinion. Okay, so
Yeah,
do read about it. Do focus on it, and by the time you catch up in grade 8, it's already far too late.
far too late.
Far
I
too late.
understand.
There's nothing that you can do at this point, because the child has either blossomed or not, and you are just hammering some things into the child's head which don't make any sense, okay, to the child. Okay, so it's too late.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's the point I want to add, that I didn't hear that
Yeah,
from you, and
yeah.
that's
Few
what.
points on this actually.
Yeah,
So one thing I wanted to mention is that from biological perspective, neuroplasticity is a big thing,
yeah,
which is the way in which how the brain can adapt to stimuli. And there is clear evidence to say that as you age, this has the most effect in your formative years. So, just like you said, elementary education, as a child sort of starts aging, the probability that your brain will be able to adapt and sort of create an identity for itself and inculcate those ideas, it goes down. So I would agree with that point. And secondly, on the point of Anganwadi workers, in fact, as a part of my semester one course, we had gone to do some field work in a village called Neriga. This is so my university is in Sarjapura, and Neriga is a village which is about 10 kilometers away. In fact, we interviewed some Anganwadi workers there, and personally, for me, looking at that village again, this is not representative, but things were actually quite nice. I mean, we found that the even though the government wasn't necessarily providing all the support that it could, people were working, people were happy. The Asha workers are in fact teaching the kids. These are absolutely little kids, so it comes into the sort of population of elementary school children. And what I found was that this village in itself is doing good, and I would agree that in general, Anganwadi workers, I mean, this result, in a sense, result can't be generalized, but Anganwadi workers is a mechanism that can work, provided, again, the government looks at the sort of capacities and accessibilities at a local level. This again brings me back to the cooperative societies point, which is again at a local level. So, given India's population, there is no way that a Delhi sort of politician from Delhi is going to be able to take policies that apply to the whole country. It's extremely contextual. Every village is different. Every village in every district is different. So there's no other approach other than approach. So that's what the
okay,
point I wanted to make was.
okay,
Yeah, yeah.
wonderful. Okay, what you have told us all is very serious talk. Let's turn to your lighter side, if there is one. What's on your lighter side?
Yeah. So I enjoy writing. In fact, there's a small para in that bio thing I've
Uh,
given. I've always been a big reader.
yeah.
Unfortunately, nowadays I don't get too much time with all the academic stuff. But I have been, especially in fiction, of course, non-fiction as well. But through that, I've always had a knack of sort of writing. I've written a bunch of poems from like long back, from
Mm,
as far as I can remember. I've been writing,
mm,
and recently I've gotten some of those published. It's there in my LinkedIn,
mm,
and I also wrote a short story.
mm.
So this was based on a queen named Abbaka Chauta, and she was a ruler in the south. She ruled this kingdom called Ullal, which is modern day Mangalore, and everybody knows about Rani Lakshmi Bai.
Yes.
Everybody knows about some of these well sort of famous queens, but in fact, this particular queen, her feats are almost as impressive, if not more.
Yeah.
So when I read about her, I was like, why is she not that known?
Mm,
So what I did was that I did a bunch of research.
mm,
So I took down the facts, which are not that many. I mean, there's very few fundamental facts that you can actually use, unless you're a historian, I guess. So I took that and I came up with a narrative on my own. I built a story, thinking about what she would have thought, what would have been the environment back in those days. And this is, I believe, this is after Vasco da Gama came to India, which is about, I think, the 16th century, or not too sure about the dates, long time back. And yeah, that was a very interesting and insightful journey. It was essentially again, it was like a research paper, except it's not as evidence backed, and a lot of input from my side. So if anybody is interested in reading about her, it's available in my LinkedIn page. So yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to add?
uh, I would say that, I mean, for students who, I mean, still don't know what to do, I would say that keep all your options open. You never know what life is going to throw at you. You don't know what opportunities you may get, you may not get. So given that you have this opportunity to, you have access to the internet, you have an idea of what sort of streams, what courses, subjects you can take, expose yourself to everything. Then you start developing a sense of what you like doing. I mean, it's always preferable if the subject you're studying is part of your personality, a part of who you are. So I would say that, I mean, obviously life doesn't always work out the way you want it to, but keep this, and if you always keep this in the back of your head, and if you always take information in using that perspective, I feel like eventually things work out. There's nothing to be too bogged down about.
All right. Good. Thank you, Partho.
That's
Let's
about,
end it here
yeah,
today.
thank you. Thank you
And
so much.
stay online. I will talk to you a little bit offline. So let's end the recording. Bye, everybody. I'll be back with another young person or an expert.